I always knew where I stood in my daughter's life, but on Mother's Day, the message became impossible to ignore. The doorbell rang at 8:17 a.m., Heather's annual obligation, dutifully discharged before she'd head to her stepmother's lavish celebration. I opened the door to find a delivery man holding a small bouquet of carnations and daisies, already beginning to wilt at the edges. No signature required, no personal delivery. "Happy Mother's Day, ma'am," he said perfunctorily, handing me the flowers and a small envelope before hurrying back to his van. Inside, the card contained a hastily scrawled message: "Happy Mother's Day. Love, Heather and Phil." Not even hand-delivered, not even properly signed. The handwriting was Phil's, not my daughter's. Just a task delegated and checked off a list. I placed the flowers in water, though I knew they wouldn't last long. The supermarket sticker was still on the cellophane wrapping, $12.99. Discounted. My phone chimed with a text. "Got the flowers? Sorry we can't visit today. Taking Elise to Cascade Springs Spa for Mother's Day. Philip is joining Warren for golf after we drop her off. Dinner at Maison Laurent tonight. Warren's treat for her special day." No invitation for me, naturally. Just information about the extravagant celebrations planned for my ex-husband's second wife. I texted back simply, "Got them. Thank you. Enjoy your day." Then I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the drooping flowers, and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what they represented. Not just a thoughtless gift, but years of being relegated to second place in my daughter's affections. Years of watching Heather gravitate toward Elise's world of luxury and connections, while viewing my modest teacher's lifestyle with thinly veiled disappointment. What Heather didn't know, what no one knew, was that the modest home where I lived, the simple clothes I wore, the unassuming Toyota I drove were all choices, not necessities. No one knew that the abstract paintings I created in my private studio behind my house, signed only as J.L. Reid, sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars in exclusive galleries from New York to Tokyo. That museum curators and serious collectors spoke in hushed tones about the reclusive artist who refused interviews and made only rare appearances through a trusted agent. That I was, in fact, one of the most successful living abstract artists in America. I had kept my identity secret for 25 years, initially to separate my art from my teaching career and divorce proceedings, then later because I cherished the purity of creating without public scrutiny. Only my agent, a lawyer and an accountant, knew that the unassuming retired art teacher Iris Blackwood was actually J.L. Reid, whose most recent triptych had sold at Sotheby's for $3.7 million. The deception had never bothered me before. Money and recognition held little interest compared to the joy of creation. My modest lifestyle was a deliberate choice, one that allowed me to donate substantial sums anonymously to arts education programs while living exactly as I pleased. But today, staring at those wilting flowers, something shifted inside me. For years, I had watched Heather's values distort as she married Philip and became increasingly fixated on status and appearances. I had observed her growing obsession with impressing Warren and Elise, her eagerness to be associated with their wealthy friends, her embarrassment when she had to explain her mother's humble circumstances. The flowers weren't just thoughtless, they were revealing. They showed exactly how much effort my daughter believed I deserved compared to the woman who had simply married well. My phone rang, a rare Sunday call from Lawrence, my agent. "Iris, extraordinary news," he said without preamble. "The Guggenheim is prepared to offer a retrospective of J.L. Reid's work. Full exhibition, comprehensive catalog, international tour. They're calling it Hidden Dimensions, 3 decades of transcendent abstraction." I absorbed this information silently, my eyes still fixed on the supermarket bouquet. "Iris, are you there? This is the validation we've been waiting for. Institutional recognition of the highest order. Would it require revealing my identity?" I asked. Lawrence hesitated. "They're hoping for at least limited participation. A curator interview, perhaps, but we could negotiate terms that protect your privacy to some degree." The timing seemed almost cosmic, this pinnacle of professional recognition arriving on the same day as such personal disappointment. "I need to think about it," I said finally. After hanging up, I made a decision. I called my lawyer. "Gerald, it's time to update my will," I said when he answered. "I need to make some significant changes." By that evening, As Heather was undoubtedly enjoying fine French cuisine with Warren and Elise, I had set in motion a series of decisions that would eventually shatter my daughter's perception of both her mother and her future inheritance. The wilted flowers sat on my counter, a reminder of why, after decades of patient understanding, I had finally reached my limit. Sometimes love means allowing consequences to unfold, even when those consequences will inevitably break your heart as much as they break illusions. The changes to my will were precise and deliberate. Working with Gerald over the next week, I restructured everything, removing Heather as primary beneficiary of my estate and establishing the Reed Foundation for Emerging Artists. "Are you certain about this, Iris?" Gerald asked, his pen hovering over the final documents. "This represents a substantial redirection of assets." I nodded, my resolve firm. The foundation will provide what I've always truly valued: opportunities for talented young artists without resources or connections. As for Heather, the provision I'd created for my daughter was both generous and demanding. She could eventually become the foundation's director and receive a substantial lifetime stipend, but only after completing 5 years of unpaid community art service, working directly with underprivileged children and demonstrating genuine commitment to values beyond material gain. "She'll contest it," Gerald warned. "She can try," I replied. "But as you've confirmed, the legal structure is sound. The choice will be hers: earn the position through meaningful contribution, or walk away entirely." As I signed the documents, I felt no vindication, only sadness that our relationship had deteriorated to this point. The Mother's Day flowers, now discarded, had simply crystallized what I'd been unwilling to acknowledge for years: that my daughter valued people based on their perceived wealth and status rather than their character or love. That evening, I stood in my studio staring at my newest canvas, a swirling composition of deep blues and fractured gold that I'd been working on for months. Unlike the precise calculations of my will, my paintings emerged from someplace beyond conscious thought, revealing truths I sometimes didn't recognize until they were complete. This one had been troubling me, refusing to resolve despite multiple attempts. Now I understood why. It reflected the fracturing relationship with my daughter, the veins of gold representing connections strained but not completely broken. My phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. Warren's name appeared on the screen, an unusual occurrence since our communication typically flowed through Heather. "Iris," he greeted me with the forced joviality that had always marked our post-divorce interactions. "Hope I'm not disturbing your evening." "Not at all," I replied neutrally. "What can I do for you, Warren?" "Well, this is a bit awkward," he began, his voice taking on the self-important tone he used when discussing business. "I've recently been advised of an investment opportunity, an acquisition, actually, and it reminded me of our conversations years ago." I tensed slightly. Warren and I had rarely discussed art during our marriage. He had viewed my teaching as a quaint hobby, not a serious pursuit. "What kind of acquisition?" I asked carefully. "Artwork," he said, warming to his subject. "Specifically, a J.L. Reed original. You remember how you used to admire that artist's work?" The irony was almost painful. During our marriage, I had shown Warren early pieces signed with my pseudonym, seeking his opinion. He had dismissed them as interesting amateur efforts without realizing they were mine. "I remember," I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "Well, my art consultant believes Reed actually lives somewhere in Portland. Can you imagine? Apparently very reclusive. Anyway, he's located a significant piece coming to market privately, and given the investment potential." Warren continued outlining the appreciation value and tax benefits while my mind raced. Someone had connected J.L. Reed to Portland. The circle of secrecy was narrowing. "Elise thinks it would complement our living room perfectly," he added. "Though between us, I'm more interested in the appreciation potential. These pieces have tripled in value over the past decade. The casual commodification of my life's work, reduced to a decorative element and investment vehicle, crystallized exactly why I had maintained my anonymity." "Fascinating," I managed. "I hope it works out for you." "Actually," Warren continued, his voice dropping conspiratorially, "I was hoping you might have insights. Given your background in arts education, perhaps you've heard rumors about Reed's identity. Any connection might give me an advantage in the acquisition." The audacity was breathtaking. asking me to help him profit from my own work after years of dismissing my artistic knowledge. "I'm afraid I can't help you," I replied truthfully. "J.L. Reid's privacy seems intentional and should be respected." After ending the call, I sat in stunned silence. The walls of my carefully constructed dual life were beginning to crack. If Warren's art consultant had traced J.L. Reid to Portland, others would follow. The Guggenheim retrospective would only intensify the scrutiny. More concerning was the potential chain of information. Warren would undoubtedly mention this conversation to Heather and Elise. If anyone began connecting dots, my art education background, my studio, my occasional research trips that coincided with Reid exhibitions, the truth might emerge before I was prepared to reveal it. I returned to the canvas, picking up my brush with newfound clarity. The composition suddenly made sense, not just a reflection of fracture, but a prelude to revelation. With decisive strokes, I began resolving the piece, understanding now that some truths demand to be expressed, regardless of our attempts to contain them. The painting, like my identity, like my relationship with my daughter, was approaching a point of necessary transformation. Whether that transformation would heal or permanently sever connections remained to be seen. 12 days after Mother's Day, as spring sunshine streamed through my studio windows, my phone rang again. Heather's name flashed on the screen, unusual for a midweek morning when she would normally be at her marketing firm. Something had changed, something had been discovered, and judging by the 3 missed calls preceding this one, my carefully constructed world was about to collide with the consequences I had set in motion. "Mom," Heather's voice trembled when I answered. "We need to talk, in person, today." The urgency in her tone confirmed my suspicions. "I'm working on a painting, Heather. Perhaps this evening?" "A painting," she repeated, a strange emphasis on the word. "Yes, I imagine you are. I'll be at your house in 30 minutes. She hung up before I could respond. I looked around my studio, canvases in various stages of completion, specialized tools of my trade, sketches and color studies that would be immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with J.L. Reid's work. Evidence of my secret identity surrounded me. Quickly, I covered the most revealing pieces and locked the studio door. Whatever confrontation was coming, I preferred it to happen on my terms, not amid the raw vulnerability of my creative space. 28 minutes later, Heather's Mercedes pulled into my driveway with a speed that suggested barely contained emotion. She emerged looking nothing like her usual polished self, hair hastily pulled back, minimal makeup, wearing casual clothes instead of her typical designer workwear. I opened the front door before she could knock. "Heather, this is unexpected." She pushed past me into the living room, then turned with eyes that burned with a mixture of disbelief and accusation. "J.L. Reid," she said, not as a question, but a statement. "All this time, all these years." So it had happened. The secret was out. "How did you find out?" I asked calmly. "Dad called me after speaking with you, mentioned his interest in acquiring a Reid piece, said he'd asked if you had any insights about the artist's identity." Her words came rapidly, tension vibrating through each syllable. Something about his description of the conversation felt off, so I started researching. She pulled out her phone, scrolling frantically. There's embarrassingly little biographical information about Reid online, but I found an article mentioning the artist studied at RISD in the 80s, exactly when you were there. Another noted Reid's work reflects formal training in color theory, combined with an intuitive approach to composition, precisely how you always described your teaching methodology. Her detective work was impressive, connecting dots I'd successfully kept separate for decades. Then I called Philip's college roommate who works at Westbridge Gallery in New York, asked him about Reid. He mentioned the artist's representative is Lawrence Harrington, the same Lawrence who calls here occasionally, whose name I've seen on your calendar. She looked up from her phone, eyes narrowing. Coincidences, perhaps. But then I remembered something from childhood, you signing my permission slips as J.L. Blackwood. Your middle name is Lenore, J.L. The room fell silent as she waited for confirmation or denial. I offered neither, watching as she processed what she already knew to be true. "Why?" she finally asked, the single word containing layers of hurt and confusion. "Why would you hide this from everyone? From me?" I gestured toward the sofa. "Perhaps we should sit." "I don't want to sit, Mother. I want answers." Despite her words, she sank onto the edge of the sofa, her body betraying exhaustion from the emotional shock. I began using a pseudonym during graduate school, I explained, taking the chair opposite her. Initially because I wanted my work evaluated on its merits, not influenced by my gender or personal connections. After graduation, as my paintings started receiving recognition, the separation between Iris Blackwood and J.L. Reid became increasingly valuable. Valuable? She repeated incredulously. You've been living like this. She gestured dismissively at my modestly furnished home, while your paintings sell for millions. In what possible way is that valuable? The question revealed so much about the gulf between us, her inability to comprehend choices not driven by financial maximization or status. The separation gave me freedom, I said simply. Freedom to teach without my students feeling intimidated or seeking connections. Freedom to create without market pressures or public expectations. Freedom to live exactly as I choose, rather than as others expect. Freedom to deceive your family, you mean? She countered bitterly. To let your only daughter believe you were struggling financially while you were secretly wealthy. I never claimed to be struggling, Heather. You assumed that based on my choices. Her expression hardened. And now you've changed your will. Gerald's assistant called Philip about transferring some estate planning documents, mentioned the new foundation. Were you ever going to tell me? Or just let me discover after your death that my inheritance had disappeared? So she knew about that too. The pieces were falling rapidly now. The foundation isn't about punishing you, I said carefully. It's about ensuring my life's work continues to support values I believe in. Values? She laughed harshly. Like honesty? Transparency? Like creating opportunities based on talent rather than privilege? Like recognizing worth beyond financial metrics? Heather stood abruptly. Don't lecture me about values when you've been living a double life for decades. She began pacing, her agitation palpable. Do you have any idea what this means? The connections we could have had, the circles we could have moved in if people knew my mother was J.L. Reid? And there it was, her primary concern laid bare. Not the deception itself, but the social advantage she'd been denied by my anonymity. That's precisely why I kept it private, I said quietly. Art isn't about social advancement, Heather. It's about truth. She stopped pacing, turning to face me with sudden calculation replacing anger. We need to fix this, she said, her tone shifting to the professional problem solver I recognized from her marketing career. Gerald can revise the will again. We should discuss how to handle your public revelation as Reid. There's significant PR potential if managed correctly. Heather, I'll call Philip. His firm has excellent connections with financial advisors who specialize in art portfolios. We should inventory everything immediately. Get updated appraisals. Heather, stop. Something in my voice finally penetrated her rapidly forming plans. She looked at me, really looked at me perhaps for the first time in years. Nothing needs fixing, I said firmly. The will stands as written. My identity as Reid will be revealed on my terms, not as a social or financial opportunity. And you need to decide what matters more, who I am or what I'm worth. Her face crumpled momentarily before hardening into determination. This isn't over, she said, grabbing her purse. I need time to think. As she stormed out, I remained seated, listening to her car accelerate down the street. The confrontation had gone largely as expected. Shock, anger, rapid calculation of advantage. What I hadn't anticipated was the hollow feeling left in its wake. For all her discoveries, Heather had missed the most important truth of all, that value and worth exist beyond price tags and social currency. That was the real inheritance I had hoped to pass on, more precious than any painting or foundation, and it remained unclaimed. Exactly 12 days after Mother's Day, my phone rang shortly after 7 p.m. Heather's name flashed on the screen. Our only communication since her discovery of my identity had been a terse text exchange where she demanded copies of my current will and financial portfolio, documents I declined to provide, suggesting instead that we meet with Gerald when she was ready for a substantive conversation about the foundation's structure. Her response had been digital silence until now. I answered with a neutral, "Hello, Heather." "Mom?" Her voice cracked with emotion, unlike anything I'd heard from her in years. "Mom, please, you have to undo what you did. I'm begging you." The raw desperation caught me off guard. What's happened? Gerald won't talk to me without your authorization. Lawrence won't even take my calls. And now Philip's friend at Christie's says... She broke into sudden sobs, the sound so unexpected I nearly dropped the phone. Please, Mom, please fix this. I'm sorry about Mother's Day, about everything. Just please change the will back. I sat down slowly, processing both her words and the frantic emotion behind them. Heather, take a deep breath and explain what's going on. She made a visible effort to compose herself. After I left your house, I called Philip, told him everything. About you being Reed, about the changed will, about the foundation. And? He was ecstatic at first. Started making plans immediately. How we'd leverage your identity once it became public. The connections we could establish, the potential for managing your collection. Her voice hardened momentarily. He even called his parents, told them their son was married to J.L. Reed's daughter. The commodification of my identity was exactly what I had always feared. Go on? Then Gerald refused to discuss details of the will without your permission. Lawrence wouldn't confirm or deny anything about your work when Philip contacted him. And this afternoon, her voice broke again. Philip's contact at Christie's mentioned rumors that Reed's entire existing collection is being designated for a new foundation, with nothing available for family distribution. I remained silent, letting her continue. Philip, completely changed, started saying we needed to reassess our position given the altered financial landscape, that perhaps I should reconsider my approach to you. Bitterness seeped through her tears, as if I were just a conduit to your assets, as if 20 years of marriage meant nothing without an inheritance attached. While I felt genuine sympathy for her pain, I couldn't help but recognize the irony. Heather was experiencing exactly what I had protected myself from all these years, being valued primarily as a financial prospect rather than a complete human being. Where is Philip now? I asked. At his brother's. Said he needed space to think. Left 2 hours ago. Her breathing became ragged again. Mom, please, I can't lose everything at once. Just tell me how to fix this. What do you want from me? An apology? Public acknowledgement? I'll do anything. The desperation in her offer resonated with uncomfortable familiarity, the sound of someone willing to perform whatever role necessary to secure financial advantage. I had heard it from countless gallery owners, collectors, and art world sycophants over the years. Never did I imagine hearing it from my own daughter. Heather, I said gently, this isn't something that can be fixed with a performance of contrition. Then what? Just tell me what to do. Her voice rose sharply. It's not about doing, it's about being. I paused, searching for words that might penetrate beyond her immediate crisis. The foundation provisions aren't a punishment to be reversed. They're a reflection of values I believe in, creating opportunities based on genuine contribution rather than entitlement. So you're just going to let my marriage fall apart? Let Philip leave because he thinks there's no money coming? The question revealed so much about the foundation of her relationship. If Philip only values you as an access point to wealth, is that really a marriage worth preserving? Silence stretched between us before she whispered, You don't understand. Our whole life is built around certain expectations. The house, the country club membership, our social circle. I understand perfectly, I replied. I've watched you construct an existence based entirely on external markers of success. I've seen you measure relationships, including ours, by their material value rather than their emotional depth. That's not fair, she protested weakly. Isn't it? When was the last time you visited without wanting something? When did you last ask about my work? Not Reed's marketable paintings, but my actual creative process. When have you valued me as your mother rather than a potential resource? Her continued silence acknowledged what we both knew to be true. The conditions in the will aren't arbitrary, Heather. The 5 years of arts community service isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity to discover what matters beyond acquisition and status. 5 years, she repeated hollowly. Philip won't wait 5 years. Perhaps that's information worth having, I suggested gently. The line went quiet so long, I thought she might have hung up. Finally, she spoke with unusual clarity. Can I come over? Not to argue or negotiate, just to talk. The request, simple and direct without obvious manipulation, represented the first potentially authentic communication between us in years. Yes, I said. I'll make tea. After hanging up, I stood at my kitchen window watching twilight settle over my garden. The conversation ahead would be difficult, painful even, but for the first time since Mother's Day, I felt a flicker of something unexpected taking root alongside the sadness and disappointment. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. Whether Heather was capable of genuine transformation remained to be seen. But at least now, with illusions stripped away on both sides, we might begin speaking truth to each other. After decades of comfortable deceptions, sometimes the most valuable gifts come disguised as losses. Perhaps this was one such moment. 3 weeks passed following Heather's tearful visit. The art world continued its quiet buzz about the Guggenheim retrospective, with speculation about J.L. Reed's identity intensifying in certain circles. Meanwhile, I continued my daily routines, painting in the morning light, tending my garden in the afternoons, reading beside the fireplace in evenings that stretched long and quiet. I had not heard directly from Heather since our conversation, though Lawrence mentioned she had contacted him again, this time with a markedly different approach. She asked thoughtful questions about your early work, he reported during our weekly call. Not market values or acquisition opportunities, but about technique and conceptual development. It was unexpected. I absorbed this information with cautious interest. And what did you tell her? Only what's already in the public record, that your early pieces showed remarkable spatial understanding and emotional depth, that your progression has been consistent yet continuously evolving. He paused. I did mention your long-standing donations to community arts programs. She seemed genuinely surprised. Whether this represented genuine curiosity or simply a more sophisticated strategy remained unclear. Experience had taught me to evaluate actions over time rather than isolated gestures, no matter how promising. On a Wednesday morning in early June, as I worked on final adjustments to the blue and gold canvas with its emerging green element, my doorbell rang. Opening it revealed not Heather, as I half expected, but a delivery person with an oversized envelope. Inside was a formal letter from the Portland Community Arts Alliance, confirming the acceptance of a new volunteer, Heather Reynolds Blackwood, for their summer youth program in the city's underserved East Side neighborhood. Attached was a personal note. Mom, I've committed to teaching basic design principles to middle schoolers twice weekly through August. It's a small start, but a genuine one. Not for show, not for credit toward the foundation requirements, but because I need to remember who I was before status and acquisition became my measuring sticks. Philip has officially moved out. Our discussion of options quickly revealed that his primary concern was maintaining access to what he called the Reed legacy. When I explained the foundation conditions couldn't be circumvented, he suggested we strategically separate while maintaining appearances until the situation resolved favorably. For the first time, I saw him clearly, not as the ambitious partner I'd aligned myself with, but as someone who viewed our marriage as a business arrangement with negotiable terms. I declined his proposal. I don't share this seeking sympathy or hoping it might influence your decisions. The foundation conditions stand, as they should. I share it because it represents my first step toward authenticity, painful but necessary. With respect, Heather. The note's tone, straightforward without manipulation or excessive emotion, suggested a shift I had not dared hope for so soon. Still, experience had taught me to approach such changes with measured optimism. One letter, one volunteer commitment did not represent transformation, merely its potential beginning. 2 days later, my gallery opening in San Francisco, the last exhibition before the Guggenheim retrospective would necessitate wider disclosure of my identity, proceeded as planned. As always, I attended anonymously, another middle-aged woman among art enthusiasts, listening to interpretations of my work without revealing my connection to it. The spatial dynamics in Reed's latest series suggest a profound reconsideration of relationship and distance, a young curator explained earnestly to a small group. Notice how these fractured gold elements simultaneously connect and separate the dominant blue fields, creating tension that feels both unresolved and purposeful. I smiled privately at how accurately she had read what I could barely articulate myself, the visual representation of my complicated maternal bond, captured in color and composition when words proved insufficient. As I moved to another corner of the gallery, a familiar figure caught my eye. Heather, standing alone before one of my earliest works, a small canvas from nearly 30 years ago. Unlike the other attendees moving quickly between paintings with social chatter, she stood in complete stillness, studying the piece with unusual intensity. I approached cautiously, stopping several feet away to observe without interrupting. She wore simple clothing, jeans and a navy blazer rather than her typical designer ensemble, and had arrived alone, without the social entourage that typically accompanied her to cultural events. "It's called Beginning Again," I said quietly, stepping beside her, as if I were simply another viewer sharing an observation. She nodded without looking away from the painting. "I know. You created it the year after your mother died. I recognized the colors from Gran's garden, those specific blues from her hydrangeas, the particular gold of her autumn mums. The personal connection she had made surprised me. I had never explained this piece's origins, even in interviews as Reed. "How did you know that?" I asked. "I've been researching your work, not market values or collection metrics, but the actual development of your artistic voice." She finally turned toward me. "And I remembered those flowers, how you planted the same varieties in our garden after Gran died, how you'd sit sketching them for hours while I played nearby." The memory she'd recovered was precise and meaningful, a moment of connection I hadn't realized she'd retained. "I never understood before," she continued, her voice low to avoid being overheard, "why you maintained your anonymity despite the success, why you lived simply when you could have had so much more." She gestured toward the painting. "But standing here, seeing your work in this context, not as assets, but as expressions, I'm beginning to grasp it." "What do you understand?" I asked, curious about her perception. "That Reed isn't a separate identity you created for commercial purposes. It's a space you preserved for authentic expression without external pressure or expectation." Her insight was surprisingly perceptive. "You weren't hiding success, you were protecting something essential." For the first time in our adult relationship, I felt truly seen by my daughter, not as a resource or disappointment, but as a complete person with values and choices worth understanding. "Are you staying for the entire opening?" I asked. She shook her head. "I have my first volunteer session at the arts program in an hour. I just wanted to see this piece again, with new eyes before beginning that work." The connection she'd drawn between viewing my early expression of renewal and her own tentative steps toward change seemed unconsciously significant. "May I walk you out?" I offered. As we moved through the gallery toward the exit, several collectors nodded respectfully to Heather, clearly recognizing her from previous Art World events. She acknowledged them politely, but didn't stop for the networking conversations that would have once been her primary purpose for attending. Outside on the sidewalk, afternoon sunlight illuminated her face as she turned toward me. "I'm not asking for forgiveness yet," she said with careful precision. "I haven't earned it, but I am asking if we might speak occasionally while I figure out who I am without all the trappings I've hidden behind." The request was modest, specific, and notably free from the emotional manipulation that had characterized so many of our previous interactions. "I think that would be possible," I replied with equal care. As she walked toward her car, not the Mercedes she'd arrived in during her previous visit, but a practical mid-range sedan, I noted the straightness of her shoulders, the deliberate quality of her movements. Not the posture of someone performing humility for strategic advantage, but of a person taking her first conscious steps on unfamiliar ground. Whether this represented lasting change or merely a sophisticated adaptation to altered circumstances remained to be seen. But as I returned to the gallery to view my own work through the unexpected lens of my daughter's observations, I allowed myself to acknowledge the quiet hope taking root alongside my well-earned caution. Some journeys begin not with dramatic declarations, but with small, deliberate steps away from familiar patterns. Perhaps this was one such journey, fragile in its beginning, but potentially transformative in its destination. Summer progressed with unusual patterns emerging in my relationship with Heather. Instead of the sporadic, agenda-driven interactions that had characterized our connection for years, a new rhythm developed, careful, tentative, but notably consistent. She called every Sunday evening, our conversations initially awkward, but gradually finding substance beyond superficial updates. She never mentioned the foundation conditions or my will, focusing instead on her volunteer work with remarkable specificity. "We're teaching the students to create meaning through limited materials," she explained during one call. "Construction paper, found objects, basic tools. It's fascinating to see how much they express with so little. Constraints often enhance creativity," I observed. "When everything is available, nothing feels essential." "I'm discovering that in my own life as well," she replied with unexpected self-awareness. "Since Philip left, since downsizing to the apartment, I felt strangely unburdened. as if I've set down something heavy I didn't realize I was carrying. These glimpses of genuine reflection intrigued me, though I maintained my measured response. Years of emotional manipulation had taught me to evaluate consistent patterns rather than isolated insights, no matter how promising they appeared. In early July, Lawrence called with news that significantly accelerated my timeline for public revelation. The Guggenheim curator is adamant about including biographical elements in the retrospective, he explained. She believes context is essential for understanding the work's evolution. Without your direct participation, they'll construct a narrative from available information, which now includes rumors about your Portland connection. The art world's investigation was progressing faster than anticipated. Warren's casual mention of Reed's possible Portland residence had apparently sparked focused research by those with resources and motivation to uncover the truth. "How much time do we have?" I asked. 3 months, perhaps 4. The exhibition opens in February, but catalog materials must be finalized by November. Lawrence paused. "Iris, we need to consider a controlled revelation on your terms, rather than allowing others to shape the narrative." He was right, of course. The careful separation I had maintained between my identities was collapsing. Better to direct the process than have it directed for me. Prepare a statement, I decided. Simple, factual, focusing on the work rather than the person. We'll release it through proper channels in September. The impending disclosure of my identity added unexpected complexity to my evolving relationship with Heather. While she seemed genuinely engaged in her volunteer work and personal reassessment, I remained uncertain whether these changes would withstand the public attention that would inevitably follow my revelation as J.L. Reed. Would the daughter who had once measured relationships by their utility be able to resist the social capital suddenly available through connection to a newly public artistic identity? Or would the transformation she appeared to be undertaking prove insufficient against that temptation? These questions remained unanswered when Heather called midweek, an unexpected deviation from our Sunday pattern. "The Arts Alliance is hosting a student exhibition this Saturday," she explained. "The middle schoolers from my program are presenting their work. I'd appreciate it if you could attend." The invitation held no apparent agenda beyond sharing what had clearly become meaningful work for her. I accepted with cautious optimism. The community center where the exhibition was held bore little resemblance to the prestigious galleries that typically displayed my work. Located in a repurposed warehouse in Portland's industrial district, its concrete floors and exposed pipes created a raw, authentic space where art existed for expression rather than acquisition. Heather met me at the entrance, dressed in practical clothes appropriate for the setting rather than the designer outfits she'd once considered essential for public appearances. More telling was her evident connection to the space. Staff greeted her by name, students approached without hesitation, suggesting relationships built through consistent presence rather than superficial association. "Malik wants to show you his sculpture," she said, leading me toward a 12-year-old boy standing proudly beside an assemblage of discarded mechanical parts transformed into a kinetic piece representing ocean waves. "Ms. Heather taught us about using negative space," he explained earnestly. "About how what's missing can be as important as what's there." I examined his work with genuine appreciation. "You've balanced the mechanical elements beautifully against the implied movement. That's sophisticated understanding." The boy beamed, looking to Heather with evident respect before hurrying off to greet other visitors. "You've connected with them," I observed as we moved through the exhibition. "They've taught me more than I've taught them," she replied, "about creating without concern for market value or external validation, about finding voice through authentic expression rather than manufactured image." The parallels to my own artistic philosophy were striking, particularly coming from a daughter who had once dismissed my teaching career as quaint irrelevance compared to her corporate marketing position. As we paused before a collaborative mural created by the entire student group, Heather spoke with unusual vulnerability. "I keep thinking about those supermarket flowers, how perfectly they represented who I had become, someone who outsourced even the most personal gestures to maintain an efficient facade of connection while investing real effort only where I perceived advantage." The insight was painfully accurate, yet delivered without self-pity or manipulation, a clear-eyed assessment of patterns she was actively working to change. "The program director has asked if I'd consider continuing through the fall semester," she added, watching the students proudly explaining their work to visitors. Expanding the curriculum to include digital design elements that might translate to career skills for the older students. Will you? I asked. Yes, she replied simply. Not for credit toward the foundation conditions, but because this work has meaning beyond what I've experienced in years of corporate projects and social positioning. As we completed our circuit of the exhibition, one of the other volunteers approached with an older woman who looked vaguely familiar. Heather, Gloria wanted to thank you personally for the additional art supplies, the volunteer said. Her granddaughter Tasha has been thriving since getting her own sketchbook and quality pencils. It was nothing, Heather demurred. Every student should have tools that respect their potential. The exchange was brief, but revealing, suggesting Heather had made personal contributions beyond her time commitment, without publicity or apparent strategic benefit. Later, as we walked to our cars, I found myself reassessing the subtle but consistent evidence before me. The Heather who had once measured every interaction by its utility value appeared to be giving way to someone capable of authentic connection and contribution without calculated return. There's something else I should tell you, she said as we reached the parking lot. I've been offered a position with the Arts Alliance, part-time development work focused on sustainable funding for their youth programs. It's a fraction of my former salary, but, she smiled slightly. It turns out money and status were poor substitutes for purpose. The observation reflected a fundamental shift in values that would have seemed impossible mere months ago. When do you start? I asked. Next month. I've already given notice at the marketing firm. She hesitated before adding, I know these changes don't erase years of behavior or automatically earn your trust. I'm not expecting that. I just wanted you to know I'm finding my way towards something more authentic than what I've been chasing all these years. As we parted, I watched her return to the community center rather than immediately leaving, back to the students and their proud families, to the meaningful connections she was cautiously cultivating. For the first time since our painful Mother's Day revelation, I allowed myself to consider that perhaps the transformation I was witnessing wasn't merely strategic adaptation to changed circumstances, but the genuine beginning of something new, a daughter finding her way back to values she had abandoned, but not entirely forgotten. The official announcement that Iris Blackwood and J.L. Reid were one and the same was released on a Tuesday morning in mid-September. The carefully crafted statement, distributed through Lawrence's office to selected art publications, emphasized the work's significance rather than the artist's identity. In advance of the upcoming Guggenheim retrospective Hidden Dimensions, artist J.L. Reid confirms her identity as Iris Blackwood, former professor of fine arts. This disclosure comes after 3 decades of anonymous creation, driven by the belief that art should be evaluated on its inherent qualities rather than the artist's persona. Blackwood will participate in limited curatorial conversations for the retrospective, but requests that focus remain on the work itself, rather than biographical details. Despite its understated tone, the announcement generated precisely the media storm I had anticipated. Art journals published special features analyzing my work in light of this new biographical context. Financial publications calculated the market impact on existing collections. Local Portland news outlets conducted impromptu interviews with neighbors who expressed astonishment that the quiet art teacher on their street was actually a globally renowned artist. Most predictably, my phone began ringing with calls from individuals who had barely acknowledged my existence previously. Distant relatives, former colleagues, casual acquaintances, suddenly discovering urgent reasons to reconnect. Warren's call came within hours of the announcement, his tone oscillating between disbelief and calculation. Iris, this is extraordinary. All these years, and why didn't you ever say anything? You never asked, Warren, I replied simply. About my work, my creative process, my artistic vision? These weren't topics that interested you. But the financial implications were irrelevant to our relationship and remain so now. His awkward attempt to suggest a dinner meeting to discuss this remarkable development received a polite but firm decline. Whatever reconciliation he might envision, personal or financial, held no appeal for me. More surprising was Heather's response to the public revelation. Rather than immediately calling or visiting, she sent a simple text. Your inbox must be overflowing with sudden admirers. When things settle, I'm here if you want to talk. No pressure, no agenda. The message's restraint, its acknowledgement of my potential need for space amidst the attention, represented consideration I wouldn't have expected from her even months earlier. A week after the announcement, as media interest began its inevitable wane, I invited Heather for tea. She arrived without the calculated punctuality that had once characterized her visits, neither conspicuously early to demonstrate eagerness nor strategically late to establish importance, simply on time, present, without performance. "How are you managing the attention?" she asked after we'd settled in the living room. "By largely ignoring it," I replied honestly. "Lawrence fields most inquiries. I've declined all broadcast interviews and limited print conversations to those focusing on the work itself." She nodded thoughtfully. "I've been approached by 3 different magazines wanting the daughter's perspective on your revelation. I declined them all." This restraint, forgoing obvious opportunities for social leverage and media attention, represented perhaps the clearest evidence of her changing priorities. "Thank you," I said simply. "It wasn't a sacrifice," she clarified. The thought of commodifying our relationship for public consumption felt repulsive, actually. I've done enough damage there without adding exploitation. We sat in companionable silence for a moment before she continued, her tone carefully measured. "Philip called yesterday, first time since he moved out." "Oh?" I kept my response neutral, allowing her to direct the conversation. "He suggested we reconsider our separation in light of changed circumstances." A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "Apparently my connection to J.L. Reid now represents sufficient value to overcome his previous concerns." "And what did you tell him?" I asked, genuinely curious about her response to this obvious attempt at reconciliation based on my newly public status. "That I appreciated his candor in making his priorities so transparent." Her direct gaze held new confidence. "And that I'm no longer interested in relationships, romantic or otherwise, where my worth is measured by external factors rather than authentic connection." The clarity of this boundary, established without drama or self-righteousness, suggested genuine growth rather than strategic positioning. "That must have been difficult," I observed. "Less than you might imagine," she replied. "It's surprisingly liberating to make choices based on internal values rather than external expectations." This insight, so aligned with principles I had lived by for decades, created a moment of unexpected resonance between us. As our conversation continued, Heather shared updates about her new position with the Arts Alliance, the grant proposal she was developing for expanded youth programming, the challenges of transitioning from corporate marketing to nonprofit development, the satisfaction of work aligned with values she was rediscovering rather than the status she had once pursued. Not once did she mention the foundation conditions or my will. Not once did she attempt to demonstrate how her current choices might accelerate her access to financial benefits. Instead, she spoke of meaningful work and authentic connections with a quiet enthusiasm I hadn't witnessed since her childhood. When she rose to leave, she hesitated briefly before asking, "Would you consider visiting the community center again? Not for a formal exhibition, but to speak with some of the older students about artistic process. Several have shown remarkable talent that deserves nurturing beyond what our basic program provides." The invitation contained no obvious agenda beyond genuine appreciation for what I might offer these young artists. "I'd be happy to," I replied. At the door, Heather paused again, her expression shifting to one of careful consideration. "There's something else I've been meaning to ask, though I've hesitated because it might seem presumptuous." "Go ahead," I encouraged. "Your studio, the space where you actually create as Reid, rather than the public persona you've maintained. Would you consider showing me that sometime? Not as a daughter claiming privilege, but as someone trying to understand the authentic creative process you've protected all these years." The request represented perhaps the first time in our adult relationship that Heather had expressed interest in my work for its intrinsic value rather than its external utility or status implications. "Yes," I decided. "Not today, but soon." As her car disappeared down the street, I returned to my kitchen where our teacups still sat on the table, 2 women in conversation, not just mother and daughter locked in patterns of expectation and disappointment, but individuals gradually discovering connection based on authentic sharing rather than obligation or advantage. Whether this represented lasting transformation or merely extended adaptation remained uncertain. 5 months of changed behavior could not immediately overcome decades of entrenched patterns. But as I gathered our cups and saucers, I acknowledged the quiet hope taking root alongside my well-earned caution, that perhaps the daughter I had raised but nearly lost to materialism and status-seeking was finding her way back to values that might sustain her when everything external fell away. Not because of my ultimatum or the foundation conditions, but because she was beginning to recognize their inherent worth, independent of any financial benefit they might eventually confer. 2 weeks after the media attention surrounding my identity revelation had begun to subside, I invited Heather to visit my true studio, not the converted spare bedroom where I had shown her childhood sketches, but the purpose-built space behind my property where J.L. Reid's most significant works had been created. The timing felt important, not during the immediate aftermath, when curiosity might be driven by novelty or status association, but in this quieter moment, when the choice represented genuine interest rather than momentary excitement. She arrived on a crisp October morning, the autumn light perfect for viewing art in its true colors. I met her at the main house, observing the subtle but significant changes in her appearance since our reconnection had begun. Gone were the status symbols she had once considered essential, the designer clothing, the calculated accessories, the careful makeup that functioned as social armor. In their place was a simpler aesthetic that suggested comfort with herself rather than concern with others' perceptions. "Thank you for this," she said simply. "I understand it's not an invitation you extend lightly." Her acknowledgement of the space's significance, not as a celebrity curiosity but as a protected creative sanctuary, indicated sensitivity I wouldn't have credited her with 6 months earlier. We walked together through the garden, following a stone path to the unassuming structure nestled among mature maple trees. From the outside, it resembled a traditional garden studio. Cedar siding weathered to silver gray, simple windows positioned for optimal northern light. Nothing to suggest the remarkable works created within. "I had this built 5 years after your father and I divorced," I explained, unlocking the door. "The first major investment I made with Reid's success." Inside, the space opened dramatically. 18-foot ceilings with clear-story windows capturing perfect indirect light. Walls lined with canvases in various stages of completion. Work tables arranged in stations dedicated to different aspects of the creative process. Heather stood motionless just inside the doorway, absorbing the environment with evident reverence. Unlike her previous visit to my home studio, rushed and focused only on confirming my identity, this time she took in each element slowly, her attention moving from the specialized tools to the reference materials to the paintings themselves with genuine curiosity. "This is where it all happens," she said softly, not as a question, but as recognition. "Where J.L. Reid becomes real. This is where Iris Blackwood works without external constraints or expectations," I corrected gently. "Reid is simply what the world calls the result." She nodded, understanding the distinction. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the current work in progress on my primary easel. "Of course." She approached carefully, maintaining respectful distance while studying the large canvas, the blue and gold composition with its emerging green element that had evolved alongside our changing relationship these past months. "This is different from your previous work," she observed astutely. "The fractured gold elements are still present, but they're connecting rather than separating the blue fields. And this green," she leaned closer without touching. "It's subtle but insistent, like new growth emerging after winter." Her reading of the visual language was surprisingly perceptive, evidence of genuine engagement with artistic meaning beyond market significance. "When did you begin this piece?" she asked. "The day after Mother's Day," I replied honestly. Understanding flickered across her face, recognition that the painting's evolution had paralleled our own complicated reconnection. "Art has always been my truest communication," I continued, moving to stand beside her, often revealing truths I hadn't consciously articulated, even to myself. "And what truth is this piece revealing?" Her question contained no calculation, only authentic curiosity. I considered how to answer without either false sentimentality or unearned optimism. "That fracture isn't necessarily permanent. That new growth can emerge from painful recognition. That transformation, while uncertain, remains always possible." She absorbed this with quiet contemplation, before turning toward the work tables where various materials were organized with meticulous care. "Would you show me your process?" she asked. "Not the technical details necessarily, but how you approach creation, how you move from concept to completion." The request reflected interest in understanding rather than acquiring, in process rather than product. I found myself responding with unusual openness, explaining how initial concepts emerged sometimes from emotional states, sometimes from visual observations, sometimes from unconscious connections that revealed themselves only through the act of creation itself. For nearly 2 hours, we moved through the studio as I shared elements of my creative practice rarely revealed to anyone. The preliminary studies, the color experiments, the occasional failures that led to unexpected discoveries. Throughout, Heather listened with attention unmarred by agenda, asking questions that demonstrated genuine engagement rather than calculated interest. "You've maintained this separate space, this protected creative life, for decades while the world speculated about Reed's identity," she observed as we completed our circuit of the studio. "That requires remarkable clarity of purpose. It required recognizing what truly mattered beyond external validation or acquisition," I replied. "Something I feared you might never discover, given the path you'd chosen." The gentle criticism was offered without accusation, simply as observed truth between adults capable of honest conversation. Heather nodded, accepting this assessment without defensive response. I spent so many years pursuing and accumulating what I thought represented success that I nearly lost the capacity to recognize actual value. She gestured around the studio. "This space, this work, it has integrity that all my careful status management never achieved." The insight reflected genuine self-awareness rather than performed contrition. As we prepared to leave, she paused before the blue-gold-green canvas once more. "Will you show me this piece again when it's complete?" "Yes," I promised, though I'm not certain when that will be. Some transformations require patience to fully emerge. We both recognized the parallel to our own gradually evolving relationship, not yet complete, not yet fully resolved, but containing elements of authentic connection that would have seemed impossible mere months ago. Walking back to the main house, Heather asked an unexpected question. "Have you considered allowing students from the community program to visit? Not as a public exhibition, but as an educational opportunity for those showing serious artistic potential." The suggestion demonstrated thinking beyond personal benefit, consideration of how my experience might serve others rather than how access to Reed might advance her own interests. "I haven't," I admitted. "But it's worth considering, perhaps for a small group with demonstrated commitment." Her smile contained no triumph at having secured special access, only genuine appreciation for the possibility. "Thank you for today," she said as she prepared to leave, "for sharing something I know you've protected carefully for good reason." As her car disappeared down my driveway, I returned to the studio, drawn back to the canvas that had been evolving alongside our relationship these past months. The green element, initially small and tentative, now required further development, perhaps expansion into areas previously dominated by fractured blue and gold. Not complete transformation, that would be both artistically dishonest and emotionally premature, but thoughtful integration that acknowledged new growth without denying the complexity that preceded it. 5 months of changed behavior could not erase years of painful patterns. 6 volunteer sessions and a career pivot did not guarantee permanent transformation of deeply ingrained values. But as I mixed new pigments for the evolving composition, I allowed myself to acknowledge what had become increasingly difficult to deny, that the daughter standing respectfully in my studio today bore little resemblance to the woman who had sent wilted supermarket flowers on Mother's Day. Whether this represented lasting change or extended adaptation remained to be seen. But the evidence before me suggested something I had nearly abandoned hope for, the possibility of genuine reconnection based on shared values rather than obligation or advantage. As autumn light filtered through studio windows, illuminating the canvas with perfect clarity, I began adding careful strokes of green to areas previously dominated by fracture, not erasing what came before, but integrating new growth that acknowledged both past and possible future with equal honesty. 1 year after the Mother's Day that had crystallized decades of painful patterns, I stood in the Guggenheim Museum watching visitors move through the comprehensive retrospective of J.L. Reed's work. Hidden Dimensions, 3 decades of transcendent abstraction, had opened to critical acclaim, with art journals praising not only the work itself, but the integrity behind my long-maintained anonymity. Reed's revelation as Blackwood transforms our understanding not through biographical voyeurism, but by illuminating the profound authenticity that has always characterized this body of work, wrote the New York Times critic. In an era of carefully cultivated artistic personas, Reed's choice to let the work exist independently of identity politics or market manipulation stands as perhaps her most radical artistic statement. The exhibition had been arranged chronologically, allowing visitors to trace the evolution of both technique and thematic concerns across 30 years of creation. My early works, including Beginning Again, with its garden-inspired palette, occupied the first gallery space. Subsequent rooms revealed stylistic developments, conceptual expansions, and the gradual emergence of the fractured yet connected spatial relationships that had become my signature. The final gallery contained my most recent works, including the blue-gold-green canvas that had evolved alongside my reconnection with Heather. Now titled simply Reconciliation, it hung on the primary wall, its careful integration of fracture and new growth, drawing particular attention from both critics and visitors. This latest piece suggests profound evolution in Reed's visual language, the curator had written in accompanying materials. The characteristic tension between connection and separation remains, but with emerging elements that suggest new possibilities within established patterns, a visual metaphor for transformation that neither denies complexity nor rejects potential renewal. As I observed visitors engaging with this piece, some spending extended time before it, others returning after viewing earlier works to reconsider it in broader context, I noticed a familiar figure entering the gallery. Heather, dressed simply but elegantly, moved through the space with unhurried attention, studying each painting without awareness of my presence. We had traveled to New York separately by mutual agreement, she arriving yesterday for the public opening, I having been here for a week, overseeing final installation details. This was her first view of the complete exhibition, including several early works she had never seen before. I watched as she paused before a piece from the period surrounding her birth, a small canvas of interlinked circles in warm tones that I had created during pregnancy and the early months of motherhood. Her extended contemplation suggested recognition of its timing and potential significance, though we had never directly discussed its connection to her arrival. Moving through subsequent galleries, she gave each piece careful consideration, occasionally making notes in a small journal, not the performance of cultural appreciation she might once have enacted for social benefit, but genuine engagement with the artistic evolution before her. When she reached Reconciliation in the final gallery, she stood motionless before it for several minutes, her attention complete and uninterrupted by the visitors moving around her. Without approaching, I could see that she recognized not just its technical elements, but its emotional content, the visual representation of our complicated journey this past year. Finally, I moved to stand beside her, our reflections faintly visible in the painting's protective glass. "It's extraordinary," she said without turning, somehow aware of my presence. The integration of past patterns with new elements, nothing erased or denied, but nothing prevented from evolving either. That was the intention, I acknowledged, though as always, the painting revealed its own truth beyond my conscious direction. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, both contemplating the visual embodiment of our complicated relationship, its fractures, its tentative healing, its continuing evolution. "I received the foundation paperwork from Gerald yesterday," she said finally, her tone matter-of-fact rather than manipulative or agenda-driven. "The first annual report documenting arts education initiatives for underserved communities." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. 47 scholarships awarded this first year, studio equipment for 3 community centers, visiting artist programs in schools without arts funding. She turned toward me, her expression reflective. "It's exactly the kind of work that would have meant nothing to me a year ago, and now feels more significant than anything I pursued in my previous life." The observation contained no calculation, no performance of values designed to advance her position regarding the foundation conditions, simply honest recognition of her own transformation. "You've completed 9 months of the community service requirement," I noted, more than consistent with the schedule outlined. It stopped being about the requirement months ago, she replied with quiet certainty. The work has its own meaning now, independent of any potential financial benefit. Again, the response reflected authentic engagement rather than strategic positioning, evidence of values genuinely embraced rather than tactically performed. As other visitors moved around us in the crowded gallery, Heather turned back to reconciliation with thoughtful consideration. "Will you create something new after this?" she asked. "Now that this piece has reached completion?" The question acknowledged both artistic and personal dimensions. Recognition that this canvas represented a specific chapter now concluded, making space for whatever might come next. "I've already begun," I confirmed. "Something that builds on these elements while exploring new territory. Much like our relationship itself, not erasing complicated history, not pretending fractures hadn't occurred, but continuing to evolve with careful integration of past understanding and future possibility." We made our way toward the exhibition exit, passing again through galleries containing 3 decades of my creative journey. Near the entrance, we encountered a small group from Portland's Community Arts Alliance, the program director and 3 teenage students whose artistic potential had distinguished them for this special opportunity. "Ms. Blackwood," the director greeted me warmly before turning to Heather, "and Ms. Reynolds Blackwood, your guidance was instrumental in making this trip possible for our students. They're beyond excited to experience the exhibition after studying these works in preparation." Heather's interactions with the students, attentive, encouraging, entirely free from condescension, demonstrated genuine connection built through consistent presence and authentic engagement. Nothing performed for external validation, nothing calculated for strategic advantage. Simply meaningful exchange between individuals sharing appreciation for creative expression. After appropriate introductions, the group moved into the exhibition, leaving Heather and me in the museum's grand entry space. "I have a reservation at that small Italian restaurant you mentioned liking when I was in college," she said. "Nothing fancy, but apparently they make cannelloni the traditional way. Would you like to join me for lunch?" The invitation, thoughtful in its specificity, modest in its presentation, represented another small but significant indicator of how profoundly her approach to relationship had transformed. "I'd enjoy that," I replied. As we walked together through the museum's spiraling architecture toward the exit, a young woman approached somewhat hesitantly, exhibition catalog clutched in hand. "Excuse me, Miss Blackwood," she began. "I'm an art education student at NYU. Your work, especially your commitment to authenticity over recognition, has been deeply influential in my own development. Would you mind signing my catalog?" Before I could respond, another visitor overheard and approached with similar request, then another. Within moments, a small line had formed, not the calculating art investors who had pursued Reed's work for financial appreciation, but students, educators, and genuine admirers connecting with the values embedded within the art itself. I looked to Heather, anticipating potential discomfort at this interruption of our plans. Instead, I found her quietly stepping aside, creating space for these interactions without resentment or calculation of how they might benefit her. When someone offered to take her place in line, assuming she was simply another museum visitor, she made no claim to special consideration based on relationship. An hour later, after I had signed catalogs and engaged in brief but meaningful exchanges with those who had waited, we finally made our way outside. Spring sunshine illuminated the museum's distinctive exterior as we descended its sweeping steps. "I apologize for the delay," I said as we reached the sidewalk. "No apology necessary," Heather replied with genuine ease. "Those connections mattered, to them and to you. The restaurant will hold our reservation." This simple accommodation, this acknowledgement of others' needs without resentment or entitlement, represented perhaps the clearest evidence of her transformation. The daughter who had once measured every interaction by its utility value to herself now demonstrated capacity for perspective beyond personal advantage. As we walked together through Central Park toward the restaurant, our conversation flowed with unusual naturalness, not the careful navigation of sensitive topics that had characterized our early reconnection, not the performance of relationship that had marked previous years, but authentic exchange between 2 adults with shared history and emerging understanding. 1 year after wilted supermarket flowers had revealed painful truths about value and relationship, Mother and daughter moved forward on paths forever altered by that moment of clarity, not with perfect resolution or guaranteed outcomes, but with authentic engagement that acknowledged both past patterns and future possibilities with equal honesty. The foundation conditions remained in place. 3 more years of consistent community service before Heather could assume directorship and access the stipend. But increasingly, those conditions seemed less like external requirements and more like guideposts for a journey she had already chosen for its intrinsic value rather than its eventual reward. Whether this represented permanent transformation or extended adaptation remained in some ways beside the point. What mattered was the daily commitment to values that sustained rather than diminished, choices consistently made not for strategic advantage, but for authentic alignment with emerging understanding of what truly constituted worth. As spring sunlight filtered through new leaves overhead, illuminating our path with perfect clarity, I allowed myself to acknowledge what had become increasingly difficult to deny over these 12 months of careful reconnection. That sometimes the most profound creations emerge not from blank canvases, but from the thoughtful integration of existing elements, the patient reworking of established patterns into new configurations that honor both what was and what might yet be. Not erasing the past, not denying complexity, but transforming it into something with integrity previously unimagined. The most challenging masterpiece of all,